You're on the air. Don't say anything crazy. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a common trait in human behavior, right? When you advise others a certain lifestyle prescription but don't follow through with it yourself. So I think we're all guilty of that, Brother Bear. Yeah. You don't have to feel too bad about it.
No, it's a really common thing, right? And most of us, I think, are more guilty of the other sin of not listening. I think you learn so much by truly listening. And I'm even guilty of it on this podcast and conversations, whether that's work or wherever, that you're almost formulating your answer while listening to the person, and in doing so, you're not really listening to the person. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's quite cumbersome with the podcasting, because it's, you know, you'll be planning ahead and thinking of kind of the next step, a bit like chess, just to make sure that you don't come across like a dumbass. And I do that all the time, when actually if I just listened and pretended that we weren't being recorded, then perhaps I'd come across as more genuine.
Yeah, I catch myself doing it all sorts of places. Not just the podcast, it would be, but I suppose it's most pronounced in the podcast because you're conscious of the recording, and so what you don't want is a natural gap, right? Anywhere, so you always want to be filling the silence. I suppose there is that. Yes,
yeah. You want to avoid kind of. I suppose you're more aware of awkward silences when you know you're being watched. There's a term for that, actually. It's called the Hawthorne effect.
That's interesting.
Yes, it's a psychological term, and it's a very broad term. It just describes the changes in behaviour that can be observed when an individual or group of people are being watched. And I know we've taken that down with the double split experiment to kind of the quantum level, but just on a purely sociological, psychological level, the Hawthorne effect is, you know, it happens to us every single day when you leave your house.
Isn't it a peculiar effect, brother? I guess it seems to permeate the most mundane things. You know, even that saying, watched kettle would never boil.
Yeah, it's such an old wisdom, but it's true, isn't it?
Yeah, it seems to like permeate quantum physics, a kettle in conversation, and the way people are when recorded and watched. Observation collapses something we don't quite understand, maybe.
Yes, yeah, sort of on the most grandiose to the tiniest quantum levels, things really do act differently when being observed. And it's weird. It's almost like when you are being observed, even if you think you wouldn't be, maybe there's just something in the back of your head that's like, actually, am I being watched?
Right. and in thinking or thinking this is the case, you know, you inevitably don't act as you would otherwise.
Yes, exactly. And I think that affects, good or bad, the quality of productivity and work. In fact, the Hawthorne effect, specifically when they applied that to work patterns, they found, I think for the first 2 to 6 weeks of being watched, productivity increased astronomically. But then afterwards, the productivity and the quality of work depreciated lower than it was at the original baseline.
Oh, really? Is that just because after being watched, sort of any subpar performance wouldn't be, I suppose, punished, or almost like it would not be noticed or acted upon?
I think it's an initial recognition of being watched brings in the feelings of must do better, must impress the powers that be, you know, the management, the government, whatever it may be. Then this only sustains so long, and that's actually replaced with a skepticism of one's own abilities.
Ooh, so that's an interesting curve.
A certain... yeah, that was the explanation I read on the Hawthorne effect, is that after that 6-week period, after that 2 to 6 week range, the initial productivity boost would be replaced with, oh my goodness, I'm continuing to be watched. You know, what am I doing wrong? How long is this going to go on for? Is there any point of this? And it actually becomes quite existential.
Good gosh, that gets quite deep quite quickly. That's interesting.
It does. Yeah, it definitely. Yeah. It's an interesting psychological experiment. I mean, it's been done with a bunch of different groups. They've done it with construction workers, factory workers, prisoners. Lots of different demographics have had this applied to them, and it's been observed in many different ways.
Are there any sort of generalized takeaways from these studies, as in, okay, given these findings, what's actually a method that's recommended that works better?
I think I'm really not sure. I think it would depend on the demographic, and it's quite situational. I think the general wisdom is that a watched worker or a closely monitored worker in the long term is never going to do as well. And this has been applied in kind of production and sales environments. If you've got the supervisor watching over the worker for more than their initial probationary period, then they're going to continue to make a lot of mistakes.
Right. Gotcha.
So that's kind of the general wisdom that's taken from the Hawthorne.
I wonder whether it, after a certain period of time, like you gave that 6-week window, it just seeds maybe if you're still being watched and therefore you're not kind of gaining anything in terms of being trusted enough not to be watched, then maybe that perpetuates a cycle of self-questioning and self-doubt, which leads to poorer performance over time.
I think that's exactly it. I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Brother Bear. It's it kind of throws your own abilities into self-doubt. You start to question, what you're really doing there. And if also someone's constantly micromanaging you, then you start to get the sneaking suspicion of, why aren't they doing my job? Do I need to be here? Can I just be replaced by a senior person that knows the process better?
Yeah, all those kinds of questions. Very interesting, Brother Bear. Very interesting.
Interesting. Yes, it applies to a lot of different scenarios, from the US prison system to work environments, and very interesting school of thought. But that's not what we're going to talk about today, Brother.
The Hawthorne effect. Welcome to the podcast. No. Okay, fine.
Yeah. We're actually going to talk for 6 hours straight about Hawthorne and his findings in Czechoslovakia.
I think what we've established, though, is we shall revisit this one because this is far too juicy to pass up on.
Yes, very juicy. We will revisit it. And may I say 1,000 thank yous for rolling your R's, which is a bit of a clue there, Brother Bear. Yes, sir. A bit of a clue. I won't make you guess, but today what I want to focus on is an ancient symbol, an ancient concept that you and I have discussed for many years, but we've put it off, and we've said to one another, well, maybe we'll discuss this next decade, or maybe next time round, but actually I thought I'd take the initiative and bring the subject of the mystical, tail-devouring Ouroboros to this podcast.
Ouroboros has landed, finally. God, I feel like I've waited a lifetime, and many lifetimes, in fact. I thought I might have to wait to the next one before I saw this one, but this is, Brother Bear, this is momentous. This is huge.
This is massive. I mean, okay, to give a bit of context.
Sorry, I had to. I can't. It's a compulsion. It's a compulsive thing. You can't stop. Once it's out, it's out.
It's like some kind of mystical Buddhist version of Tourette's syndrome. We just have to burst out. Ouroboros.
It's actually a delicious word if you think about it. It's the way the R's roll like wavelets over the pebbles on a beach.
Yes, it gives a whole new meaning to rolling off the tongue. The or as you can pronounce it, Ouroboros.
Ouroboros. And tell me, Brother Bear, where does is it Latin or Greek? Where does it come from? The Ouro.
How linguistically perceptive of you, Brother Bear. It is actually translated from Greek. The word Ouroboros or Ouroboros, it is actually Greek or Attic Greek for tail devourer. So, yes, I understand from my research that it refers to the circular or figure eight shape of the snake or dragon enveloping itself. And interestingly enough, this is a lot older than even I anticipated. One of the oldest mythological symbols that humans know about. So really, since the early uses of this symbol, it has been really known as a regenerative cycle of life icon. It's been used to refer to enlightenment, renewal, and infinity. And beyond.
And is it from probably more of a philosophical background as opposed to any particular religion?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. So obviously it's been repurposed for mystical, religious, spiritual applications, but it actually has its roots in ancient alchemy. There's nothing really overly religious in the mono or polytheistic way that you or I would understand having this conversation in 2021. It's more alchemistic. So it's quite interesting, really, because the initial known, it's kind of undergone a journey of its own. So the initial known symbol when it first appeared was actually on the tomb of Tutankhamun.
No way. It's fascinating. Yes. And so it goes back to, would you say therefore its first sort of, I suppose, appearance is with the ancient Egyptians?
Absolutely. So it is a first and foremost Egyptian symbol. So the oldest known Ouroboros appeared on the golden shrine of King Tut in 13th century. Bloody King Tut! Bloody London exhibit!
The Ouroboros.
Bloody hell, me and Shannon went down to bloody Soho. We saw King Tut in a bloody tomb.
That bloody snake eating its own tail. Don't know what it was doing. Anyway.
Don't know what it was, right? But I was thinking about it over a pint.
It's quite deep, actually.
Basically,
like
King...
its tail, like it's destructive but creative at the same time.
This northern man drunk out of his mind actually summarises 1,000 years of wisdom and tradition.
He actually captures
over a
it
pint
better
of Guinness.
than the book Mythos by Stephen Fry.
He shits on all the scholars for a number of millennia. Just sat in a pub in Soho with Sharon.
Just because he's had just the right amount of Guinness.
Through intervals of being on the fruit machine.
It works.
But it works. That's the formula. But yes, to bring it back into King Tut, basically 13th century BC, there was a bit of a lull in traditional religion, brought about by the predecessor of King Tut, Akhenaten, and this is what a lot of the cryptologists and Egyptologists think brought about the original Ouroboros on his shrine. So that's kind of the first known symbol of it, and really what the Egyptologists, which I think is a damn interesting discipline to be involved with, Egyptology, they always interpreted it contextually, again through hieroglyphics, as a mystery of cyclical time which flows back into itself. And the Egyptians used it. This is very early on. This is the first known ever use of it by humans. They understood it as a series of repetitive cycles instead of describing a linear or constantly evolving pattern. And central to the use of it was really the iconic description of the Nile flooding, which was cyclical, and the journey of the sun, which of course they worshipped.
Right. So two very important dynamics, I suppose, that they relied on to a very large extent. That was almost informed.
Yes, geographical.
Fantastic. Well, the Ouroboros, because of course we all know about the Rosetta Stone, and hieroglyphics for the longest time was, no one knew what the hell the Egyptians were saying until I believe it was the breakthrough that was the Rosetta Stone that helped them get there, because it was, I think, 3 languages on that one stone, which was Hebrew, Greek, and of course hieroglyphics, and it served as a very useful translation, essentially. And
Yes.
I think it allowed people to unlock a lot of the meaning captured within the, I suppose, illustrations that are hieroglyphics, right? But it's fascinating to hear that actually, although the name that's been given to it was Ouroboros, I don't know if we know the Egyptian name for this symbol.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know the Egyptian name, and I think the interpretations of it all began after it was brought to Greece. But yes, you're right. The Rosetta Stone, absolutely a blueprint for our understanding of ancient civilizations.
What's interesting
Yes,
is that
go
maybe,
ahead.
you know, the sort of meaning that the Egyptians attributed to it, maybe, yes, cyclical and around the seasons and the natural cycles that they relied on. But then, you know, there's always the other cultures that adopt those symbols and, you know, layer their own meaning onto these things that isn't necessarily particularly close to the original intent.
Yes, now it's interesting you say that. So this is an incredibly fascinating topic, Brother Bear, because the Ouroboros actually underwent this crazy journey from Egypt, and believe it or not, its meaning never changed much. So its meaning was retained throughout time and geography. So it transcended these different variables. But as I say, it ended up, so it started from Egypt, it actually found its way to Greek alchemists of Hellenistic Alexandria. And there was a lot of information. It's assumed there was a heck of a lot of information in the Library of Alexandria.
Yes, and there's so much knowledge
Which,
lost in
of
that
course,
fire.
yes, exactly. So, unfortunately, the understanding of the Ouroboros is quite kind of mystical and surface level, but that, I suppose, gives it a seductive quality in another way, in a kind of more optimistic way of looking at it. Yeah, I think its representation in Cleopatra was slightly different. It was written on papyrus, and really it was one of those symbols that when it went into the Hellenistic and Greek geography, it became a symbol that meant one is all. And there was actually a maxim that was discovered on a piece of papyrus that gave an ancient Hellenistic definition of the Ouroboros. And this is what it said. It was a double ring, by the way, so it was a more infinity-shaped depiction. But it said, one is all. Yes. One is all, but one is only a part. One is all, and by it all, and for it all. If it does not contain all, then all is nothing.
Wow.
So it's a bit of a mouthful, but quite intriguing.
Do you know what it brings to mind, strangely, straight away, is the sorts of ramblings we love to fall asleep to with Alan Watts. You know, you are it, you are one. One is you, you are it. And it's kind of... And it's also the insights people tend to pull from psychedelics, right? And there's always been this conversation. I actually saw a very fascinating JRE podcast with this guy who was really looking into quite a niche topic, which was spiked wines back in the ancient world. So wines that would be spiked with all kinds of sensual psychotics, psychedelics of all types, or was there any evidence of that? And obviously that's very difficult because organic matter obviously decays with time, and there's little to no evidence left at this point. But you know, you could potentially infer some of that meaning from old illustrations, old carvings of whether wines were spiked with these psychedelics intentionally for the purpose of ritual and experience, and actually used on a relatively regular basis, whether that was a religious ceremony or sort of a pagan ceremony, to almost, they had some understanding of what these compounds were and what was required to almost attain a certain level, right, of I suppose experience. But it's interesting. I sort of ramble into this in the ancient world and the psychedelics because it is the sort of insight that psychedelics, I don't know, I suppose coincidentally or not coincidentally also seem to give a lot of people, and it's often the shared experience people have, right, that we are part of it and you are it, and this kind of feeling of complete ego vanishing, and you base an ego death, as they call it, right? Particularly with the likes of DMT, where you literally are just pulled out and you lose any sense of self, any sense of a border, a body, almost you just becoming almost fluid with the ether for that brief period. And so it's interesting that those experiences, mirror and almost are articulated exactly to the word as to what you just articulated there.
Yeah, God, so much to grapple with there, Brother Bear. But I think your summary there of DMT and some of the psychedelics that trigger an ego death, they work so much in tandem with that end of the quote, the end of the maxim: if it does not contain all, then all is nothing. And that's kind of the sort of the hippie mantra of everything is connected. But actually, there's so much truth in that when you gain a greater understanding of nature, and a bit of metaphysics and the way that humans relate to the environment. The ancient stuff is interesting, and I think it's funny you mentioned Alan Watts, because one of his books, actually, Out of Your Mind, is the book, has the wave depiction of the Ouroboros. And I know Alan Watts has mentioned it in a number of his lectures and seminars. But there's different depictions of it. You have the snake eating its tail is the most ancient. The dragon eating its tail is a more kind of Nordic, Norse representation of that. But the wave depiction is kind of a more Eastern philosophy take on it. But it's an incredibly hard-hitting symbol, and I think if you can come to understand it and meditate on it, I do believe that it will bring some of the ego-destroying benefits that you would get from, say, taking DMT.
No, it's a very particular symbol, and is it always represented by a serpent of some description, or is it something else?
No. As I say, a dragon can be the kind of the secondary representation. The wave is a more Eastern tradition representation. It's had, and this is where it gets quite interesting. So there are different depictions through different civilizations, but not just that, but slightly varying interpretations. I mean, it generally has retained its meaning in broad brushstrokes. But to give a bit of color to that statement, Hinduism, so really, for the way it looks at it, is the kind of foundation upon which the earth rests. And that's the way that Hindus kind of interpret the Ouroboros. There's kind of Roman interpretations of it that have been recorded for it to represent boundless time. So again, comes back to infinity. And that's kind of that depiction is more the Ouroboros entwined around its own body, so in like an immense tangle. So there's a couple there. You've also got the representation of it, interpretation as a fertility symbol. Okay. So the tail is represented as a phallus and the mouth as a womb. But again, this comes back to the same infinity, birth and death. Your life and death and kind of creative destruction, really.
It's fascinating, because it almost seems like the one commonality is an unbroken line, right? And so therefore the symbol of infinity.
Yeah.
So it feels like whether it's a perfect circle or almost a figure of eight, that there seems to be... It speaks, I suppose, to the cyclicality of everything, right? The breathing, yes. The day, the night, the rotations, everything is cyclical. And I suppose in that cyclicity, that's the cycle that just perpetuates over time in different forms, I suppose, until you're back at the start, which is what I suppose any of these continuous lines are ultimately. And then almost a rebirth, a death and rebirth, almost in an ever changing and ever iterative renewing manner, right? So I suppose this also could speak to some of the Buddhist traditions with, reincarnation and afterlife, and There was a really interesting video actually I saw, which was by these guys on YouTube called Kurt Zart, and they're originally a German production company. It's just of like very interesting, deep ideas, but narrated in a very simple manner with very simple sort of graphics. But they went into this interesting idea, just a fun for thought experiment more than anything, that, you know, we almost live our lives and then we die and then we're reborn as someone else. So, you know, this life I am who I am, then I'm reborn as a woman in Vietnam in the 1700s, you know, in the rice paddies, picking rice most days and farming. And then you're only done when you've lived every human life ever, and only at that point do you ascend to some higher being, whether that be a god or something else. But it was just a fun thought experiment, and I thought it just spoke to that idea of cyclicity and renewal and almost evolution.
Yeah, I think that's quite a beautiful thought experiment. I suppose it talks a lot to the concept of nirvana, and fulfilling out one's dharma through a number of different lives, throughout different points in history. And then, of course, when you get to nirvana, you're not done, because assumedly, you know, that continues on for eternity.
Right, you go back and have another lesson via another life, and essentially experience, you know, the good, the bad, the ugly through another perspective. And I think that's what's going to bring us together. And there was a great podcast, you probably listened to it as well, with our great friend Duncan Trussell, and on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he was talking about how, and I never really thought about it more deeply than, you know, how it was spoken about in church, which was, you know, the saying that Jesus had, that, you know, what unto you do to me, you do to your brothers and sisters. You know, treat others as you would like to be treated, because it is you. You know, everyone around you is just different versions of you.
Yes.
And I think there is like a poetic and also scientific truth to that. That and why wouldn't you know, treat others as you would like to be? Because literally, you're doing it to yourself, and it wasn't meant metaphorically or sort of poetically. It was literal.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of piece of advice. Well, it's a beautiful piece of poetry that you can extract from the Bible. A lot of the Bible is actually transcendental poetry, and I think that statement, you know, treat others as you would expect yourself to be treated, it does infer very strongly that, you know, we are all part of the same hive, and everyone else is a different version of you. You could have been born as them. It's lucky that you were born in, say, a developed country, or it's, you know, it's just chance rather that you were born here instead of as, I don't know, a train driver in Ethiopia.
Exactly.
And these are all kind of these are all kind of chants, spiritual chants, really. And I think that the interpretation of that, which you just alluded to, is a correct one. And what the Bible was talking about there is also the lack of free will that sometimes we should recognize, in that we are all products of, I suppose, our environments and our upbringing, and the experiences have shaped us. And some of these were very much decided by chance as well. So one way to interpret that is, again, you just have to diminish or completely do away with the judgment that you have for others as much as you can. And that's so ahead of its time, I mean, for something that was written thousands of years ago.
Yeah, exactly. It reminds me of that parable, you know, where I think there was an adulteress, right? And she was about to be killed, essentially stoned, by a group of villagers. And sort of Jesus came upon this scene and said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Oh, we're about to stone her. She's, you know, committed adultery." And he was like, "Very well. So, the first of you, any of you who have never sinned before, please cast the first stone." And I think it's that kind of thing that, you know, we recognize that whether there are truly evil people in this world, it's often just a product of terrible experiences, none of which were their fault in many cases, right? And so I think we've got to recognize this is a huge amount of luck and just happenstance in it. It's always been a mystery to me, right? Why this instantiation of consciousness happens to be me in this body. It's an absolute mystery, right? And it's baffled me since I was a child, and I never really understood it. Why am I looking at the world behind these eyes and looking through the world through these eyes, and why am I not looking through your eyes? And why? It's a very like basic and stupid, but also very profound and deep question. But there's really no answer for, right? Why did this particular instantiation of consciousness happen to take this form and be born in this place to these people? I don't know. I don't think anyone really knows.
I don't think anyone knows, and I think the question's more interesting than the answer. I think to be truly free and good to others, you have to always ask that throughout your life. That's what makes life beautiful. It's the unknown. But what we can do is we can use symbols like the Ouroboros, I suppose, because they're so universal, to represent these kind of feelings and represent that kind of feeling of infinity.
Yeah, I think, symbols like the Ouroboros and myths in general have an incredible power an incredible explanatory power, right? Unlike anything else. Ultimately they're stories, right? And I suppose implicit in the Ouroboros are stories of one sort or another, of cyclicality, of rebirth and death, of light and darkness and all that good stuff, and yin and yang. But I suppose they have a profound ability to have explanatory power across cultures and generations. And you see it's a crazy ancient symbol, right? It's kind of mad because that thing is thousands of years old in truth, and yet we can still find utility and aspects of it that are very applicable to 2021.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of those symbols that, thousands of years ago it was being painted on tombs and probably discussed in spiritual lectures and on buildings and things like that. And here we are using the internet, talking across two continents about this symbol and how it applies to our life. There could be nothing more universal in terms of something that transcends time and civilizations as the Ouroboros.
It's so beautiful. I'm gonna cry.
I'm gonna fucking well up. You know what though, Brother Bear? Before I forget, it actually has a galactic meaning as well, and I think you'll love this, because in mythology, when they barely understood the Milky Way, they actually used the Ouroboros as a symbol to represent it in its entirety.
Oh.
So it's kind of been an interesting take on astronomy as well from people of the antiquity. The Milky Way was seen as the serpent as a whole, and at a galactic central point near the Sagittarius star chain. So that's kind of there was a galactic use for it as well in terms of explaining the heavens, and many ancient used the galaxy, of course, to calculate cosmic and Earth cycles as best they could.
That's fascinating. I mean, like a coiled snake, if you imagine a snake with its head at the center, all perfectly coiled up in a spiral. So that kind of is the shape of a galaxy, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And again, like it's almost like the Fibonacci sequence. It's like the magic number. Or the honeycomb pattern. It's one of those symbols that it's as old as the mountains, as the trees. It's something that has just transcended every civilization. And there's been other takes on it. So I went a little deeper in some of the kind of contemporary adaptations, and Escher drew paintings that were actually completely inspired by the Ouroboros.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. There's I don't know if you're familiar with the two hands painting one another.
I probably am. I've probably seen it. Yeah, because I've been to an exhibition by him. But go on. Yeah, I think I am.
Yeah, it's a fairly recognizable one. But the Escher painting, you look at the painting and you think, well, which hand drew which hand, and they both drew each other, I suppose, and they both didn't draw each other, and it kind of brings up a sort of Schrodinger's cat scenario in your mind. And I suppose looking at the painting again, you get kind of chicken and egg parallels as well. It's an Ouroboros like painting that conjures up so many existential thoughts, and I think that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think there's a profound patterns in the universe. You spoke to the Fibonacci sequence, things like the golden ratio, and you see it everywhere, right? Even like the golden ratio corresponding to the spiral arms of the galaxy and the proportions of those versus something like a succulent and the shape of its leaves, or the core of a flower corresponding to the angles that are described by the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratios match up exactly. And I think it's quite amazing that these things, these seemingly mathematical constants, underlie so much of the natural world. And what's fascinating is that you have also maybe less theoretical, more tangible, even if you look at the shapes of galaxies, because galaxies, when you really zoom out, they start to form these structures in terms of where you have areas of more density, in terms of more galaxies, and then where you have areas of less density and less galaxies. And you really, really zoom out and start to look at things on the macro scale, on the universal scale, you start to end up with this almost node and network structure where you have nodes and clusters of galaxies linked together by these almost strings of galaxies. So they seem to cluster around strings and nodes, and when you start to zoom out, it looks like a 3D network of nodes interconnected in all sorts of 3D manners, right? Up, down, left, right. And it starts to actually resemble and be uncannily similar to what we see when we look at a human brain and the neurons. Yeah.
Really?
It's quite amazing, and it's almost like something
That's
on this macro scale, and yet it has like a spooky similarity to human neurons and the networks those neurons have.
Now, doesn't that just conjure up a meaning of life kind of interpretation there?
Yeah. Are we just living in someone's brain?
Yeah. Are we living in someone's brain? Yeah, absolutely.
It was always like it goes back to fractals, right? A fractal, it's just a pattern repeated over and over and over again, and you can keep zooming out, but it will keep being the pattern within the pattern within the pattern. Equally, you can zoom all the way in, and you can keep zooming in, and it's just going to be the same pattern.
Yeah, and you think you're kind of chasing it, and you're getting closer.
But you get no closer, exactly. So you've seen these videos, because I know by you saying that, I know you understand it.
Yes, yeah, I know. I've seen the coils, and some of them kind of, some of the ones I've seen resemble kind of jellyfish tentacles, and you feel like you're either getting to the beginning or the end, but you're getting nowhere.
Exactly. There doesn't seem to be a start and end. And this is, I suppose, the essence of the Ouroboros.
The Ouroboros.
It's an infinite cycle up and down. A start and end is meaningless on a circle.
Yes. It's linear. I suppose linear interpretations are fruitless, and a lot of people have tried to depict it in other strange ways. There's actually a Japanese artist called Kusama, and he tried to create this amazing. You should really check it out on YouTube. That's the closest you'll be able to see what it's like, until you can visit it in person. But it's kind of like a glittering infinity mirror room installation. Ooh. So you can imagine this kind of trance-like 4x4 structure, and it just creates an infinity of not just mirror images, but light, and the way he's positioned all the lights. And then, in his words, in Kusama's words, he tried to represent a cyclical eternity. Whether or not he's aware of the Ouroboros, I don't know. I'm sure he probably is, but I feel like that's such an interesting take on it. And I'm sure we've all found in our more drunken moments ourselves staring at infinity mirrors in elevator.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that's probably the most the most common experience where you've seen one of those. But they're ever entertaining, right? Whether drunk or sober, I've always found them really cool.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. You always feel a little drunk
yeah,
seeing them.
exactly. I've heard, mirrors sort of talked about as mathematical perfection, right? Because it's the only thing that's, I suppose, truly depicting infinity. As although we don't have the mental capacity to wrap our heads around infinity, we can try and start to, although we'll never get there. Sort of have a go, whilst knowing you're never actually going to reach or truly grasp the concept itself. And the way I've thought about this is, sometimes as a child I used to torture myself just thinking about the idea of, an afterlife that goes on forever and ever and ever, with time as we know it. So if we sort of start thinking about that as a life that goes on forever and ever and ever, you actually inevitably start to get sort of a sick, nauseous feeling at the pit of your stomach. And if you don't get that, you're not thinking about it hard enough.
Yeah, yeah. I think if your stomach and head aren't spinning from those kind of thoughts, then yeah, you're not thinking deeply about that kind of mental fracture.
It's pretty horrible, terrifying infinity. Oh, I mean, it's nothing like infinity, because infinity is a lot longer than that. But even if you start to try and fathom the concept, it's terrifying. because I started to, as a kid, I was like, good God, what am I going to do with all that time? I've got like all these millions of years and trillions and billions of years to explore the galaxy and see every planet a million times over. Like, at some point I'm going to be like, right, what's next? Because, a trillion years in, I've not even started in the sort of context of infinity.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're only scratching the surface, the tip of the iceberg. It's like that question, that age-old children's question, well, how big is the universe? Well, the universe is infinite and it's actually always expanding. Well, hold on, if it's expanding, then does it have an edge? Well, I guess it kind of does. Is there a wall there? Well, what's over that wall? Nothing's there. Well, what's nothing?
Yeah, and I suppose with regards to the universe, we don't know whether it's finite or infinite. So I suppose we don't know, really. What we do know is we can only see as far as we can, and so there is a visible edge to the universe, after which it goes black, because the light from there, if there is light, and there quite likely is, has just not reached us. So there is a horizon to what we can see, just by virtue of how far away it is and how fast it's moving away from us, right? If it's moving faster than the light can travel, then, and in the meantime the galaxy's vanished. So many of the stars we look up at night don't exist anymore, likely.
Right, you're looking at, if something's 20 light
you're
years
looking at something
away
in
and
its
the lights
distant
start
past.
traveling.
Literally, you are looking at something as it did look in its distant past, in all cases, right?
Yes.
The sun is the exception to that, and all of our local planets and all that stuff, because you're looking at the sun as it was 8 minutes ago.
8 minutes ago. But for many stars, as you say, they could have they could have ended, and you've got a lot of stars. Okay, I'm looking at light from 1872 or something like that. So
right. Well, exactly.
It's incredible.
And there's, by that same token, there'll be stars that are born now that are shining that we can't see just yet because the light's not reached us.
Exactly. So there is a natural kind of rebirth and death cycle.
Yeah, it is amazing how cycles just permeate everything, right? Up and down from your heartbeat to stars, the death of stars, right, and the dust they throw out, and then that births planets and new stars. Because star nurseries are just nebulae, and nebulae are just dust, and the constituent elements of and gases of hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, all sorts, and it's almost a melting pot. And a creative melting pot where you have stars coalescing, being born, dying, and then spewing out loads of heavy elements that then in turn create more planets and stars. So it's a very beautiful, I suppose, creative, destructive, yet, like I said, I suppose, birthing process.
Yes, yeah, no, that's fascinating. Such a fascinating take on it when you look at the concept of infinity and rebirth on an intergalactic level. or universal level. I think that sort of a modern depiction, I mean, it's depicted in so many ways, right? I mean, even if you look at kind of modern economics and political ideas based on the concept of creative destruction, I think that a lot of thinkers have applied those quite scientific or, most spiritual forces and thoughts to modern economics. Funnily enough, the Ouroboros was actually quite significant in the Renaissance period and the Enlightenment period. So when people were kind of giving a bit of pushback to sort of older Christian interpretations of religion, a lot of the Renaissance thinkers were looking at the Ouroboros as man's gateway to both divinity and the earthly. So even though these are at odds with one another, so the kind of the practical, pragmatic, boots on the ground man, but also the divine side of man that can create immense structures, like dams and bridges and all these things and space shuttles and so on. These have to exist in unison. So I do believe there's some truth there. And some of the die-hard kind of maximalist capitalists, like Ayn Rand, of course, interpreted this as kind of man being God and man having, or humans having a more, a very divine streak that exists in tandem with a very earthly streak, which no other animal has managed to pull off that we know of. So that's kind of a more modern take on it and a more modern kind of understanding of those forces.
Yeah, I think that Randian take is missing a bit in today's society, and I think we've gone a bit too far the other way on the seesaw, in that we're so self-deprecating and sort of self-whipping in pity and sort of self-malevolence. I think we could do with a good dose of sort of thinking, hey, we've got organised society, we've created democracy, electricity, many great things that have lifted people out of abject poverty and misery, and so I think there is reason to be proud, as well as also being mindful that we're not the finished article, but we're well on the way to being one, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the Randian philosophy is very much focused on look at excellence in humanity, look at man and woman's achievements, whether it be, space flight or locomotive engine or penicillin, the COVID-19 vaccine. It's very easy to self-deprecate and as a society say, oh, look, we're shit, we're terrible. But actually, there's a great amount of achievement, innovation, and miraculous brilliance that's come out of humanity. As you say, we're far from being the finished article. There's a lot of work to be achieved. There's a lot of exploitation and lack of mobility to extinguish, but there's certainly a heck of a lot to celebrate.
And Bitcoin. Yes. Oh, there's so many things to. I'll always find a way to squeeze it in.
Right, weave it in. 2 hours now on Bitcoin. Let's go.
My God, it took me 47 minutes to get it in. Anyway, I'm going to show my Bitcoin now. I'm going to do a shameless plug. No, I'm not. But I believe we have gone too far the other way, brother. But I think there is benefit to self-criticism and questioning, relentless self-questioning. But I think only to a point, right? As with anything, I think at some point it can be genuinely on balance destructive and actually counterproductive to genuine progress. I think there has to be a sort of a balance to the other side, because it ultimately, if you mentally whip yourself to that extent, I think it's quite limiting and potentially undermining in terms of one's abilities. And then I'm talking, on the micro scale of the individual, but then also society at large, right? We can only whip ourselves so much before we become sort of useless, self-pitying slugs. We need to, I suppose, at some point pick ourselves up and realize that agency is within our hands, and that's an empowering idea that we can do something with, and also realize that we have the ability to move forward, because look how far we've come, right? And everyone's standing on the shoulders of giants. The fact that we're able to connect over this, we didn't invent the internet, we didn't invent the circuit boards. It's actually amazing that if you were to cut the ribbon of continuous human progress, even for a generation, we would fall behind centuries because of because of the knowledge we're sitting on and the inventions we're sitting on.
Yeah, all the kind of groundwork and the pillars and foundations that have been put in place. We talk about kind of AI and IoT and Neuralink, some of these, nascent inventions, but these are very much sitting on the shoulders of everything from, flight, travel, and locomotive engine to the understanding of the atom. So, yeah, I think you have to look again at the positive achievements. You actually said you said this in quite a beautiful metaphorical way, Brother Bear, about overcorrections, and I think we are actually in an age of overcorrections in a sense of, okay, we want to correct certain ills that humanity has made, and don't get me wrong here, humanity has been wrought with horrible decisions throughout the last few millennia, but as you say, in modern days, it's like driving a car into the wrong lane, and then you correct it back into your lane, but you overcorrect it and go onto the hard shoulder. And I think we're in that kind of hard shoulder position right now. And again, we don't want to become those self-pitying slugs you refer to.
Slugs there.
Slugs
yeah, but it's true, because I think social media doesn't help. Why it doesn't help? It doesn't help because I think it serves sometimes as a bit of a loudspeaker for one opinion or another, right? And so these swings of overcorrection are exacerbated by social media and the loudspeaker that it is, whether that's Twitter, Facebook, or just, I suppose it's a loudspeaker for outrage for one side and the other side, whatever the debate, whatever the topic. And so I suppose these swings become dangerously extreme, and I suppose that kind of is what we've seen over the last decade, I suppose, right, with the swing to nationalism in Europe, not excluding America from that either. In fact, generally globally, right, the swing towards nationalism, and then the anti-movement sort of towards globalism, and those things, threatening to, not maybe exaggerating a little bit, but to sort of tear society down the middle, right? And so I suppose we've just got to be careful, because there are second and third order consequences that maybe we don't think about fully, particularly with social media. I mean, on the surface, Facebook is an incredibly sort of utopian, beautiful idea, connecting the world. I mean, connecting the world and being able to talk to anyone, anywhere instantly is a beautiful idea. But then it also happened to exacerbate and loudspeak the things that outrage us most, because those things got the most views and most likes and most scrolls. And so by definition, the things that are most outrageous get the most traffic and, pulled to the top of your feed. And that in itself starts to feed a more hateful and aggressive and divided society. And you couldn't have potentially, I don't think anyone really could have predicted that 12 years ago.
No, I think it's a big 180 to how people perhaps saw the next 10, 20 years, going back to the turn of the millennia to the year 2000. I think that social media unfortunately has a tendency to categorize people into three groups. Two of those groups are kind of the extreme ends, and as you said, you've got the nationalist kind of othering group that seeks to blame others, other people, other countries, kind of almost Luddite movements. They hold back development. You've also got the anti-movement of that, and they want to kind of in a more nihilistic way tear down society. And then in the middle, which I think actually represents a very large group of people, unfortunately, is you have the apathetic. And it's a shame, really. I mean, that famous quote, I think it's been passed down from Jane Goodall: the greatest danger to our future is apathy. And it's that big block of individuals in the middle that have been alienated from the extremism. So that's the unfortunate side to social media, right? I think it's increased the extremist polls and also massively inflated that apathetic centre block.
I think you're right. I think we forget about that centre block quite a bit, and it's easy to ignore, I suppose, because it's apathetic, right? And so maybe not as vocal and visible. But yes, I suppose it's the not doing. That's as much of a problem as the extremes.
Yes, absolutely. So I suppose, what can we learn from the Ouroboros? Why does it matter? And what can we, which is probably going to be the title of this podcast, why the bloody hell does it matter? Why the bloody hell has everyone from the Mayans to the bloody Renaissance alchemists put it as their most important symbol? No, well, I think it's actually very meditative, and I think it's easy to get caught up in the negativity of the present, or the kind of struggles of present day. Maybe 50 years ago we would have been talking about the civil rights movement, and how we're annoyed this can't take off, and that it's being fought by kind of reactionary forces. Maybe 40 years before that we would have been talking about the Germans bombing us, and how can we overcome the next blitz. Now our struggle is kind of more individualistic, isolationary in its nature, more digital in its vehicle. And I think that the Ouroboros teaches us that every time has a great amount of struggle. Every civilization, every geography faces its own woes and worries. And with the knowledge of infinity, and with the knowledge of rebirth and creative destruction, every individual can overcome that to some degree.
Beautifully put, Brother Bear. To me, what I get out of it, I suppose, and this is just my view that I've come up with right now, so I might be completely wrong, but it's more that I seek comfort, I suppose, and I find comfort in the concept and the mythological symbol that is the Ouroboros, in that it's all going to be okay in the end, because, what goes around comes around, and I think there is some comfort to be found in things that are cyclical, because the sun will come up and it's going to be a new day.
So simply put. And it's funny, we've actually gone right back to those initial Egyptian sun-like interpretations there, Brother Bear, and I do appreciate that. I think, as a closing note, the Ouroboros, it is cyclical. It goes up, it goes down, just like the sun, and it is a symbol that basically defies time and civilizations. It is perhaps fitting, I suppose, that the Ouroboros marks the beginning and the end of never-ending stories.
Brother Bear, thank you so much for the education.
Amen to you, brother.
Out!